Well, good evening. It's time for us to begin our Bible class. We are continuing in our study in the book of Revelation, and we are hopefully, well, I know we will, we'll wrap up our analysis of the seven bowls of wrath that have been poured out, and we will eventually then get into the symbolism of Babylon that is spoken of in the 17th and also in the 18th chapters, and we'll see how far we can get. I want to tell you that because everything has been kind of thrown into a tizzy as far as the planning was concerned, what I have done is I have printed off all of the question sheets that I have up to this point, and that would be up to lesson number 22, which takes you halfway through the book of chapter 20. They are all in the back there. Some of them have dates on them. I'm no longer putting dates on the ones I do now because the dates are they're superfluous. We don't need them. And I put them up there too because I'm not exactly sure where we're going to be anytime the class, I know where we're going to be once the class ends, I just don't know where the class is going to end each time. And so because of that, it makes it a little bit more challenging to to actually be able to carry this on in some kind of an organized fashion in which we're following after the syllabus that I prepared, because obviously that's no longer in play anymore either. But we are going to get through this book eventually. We're going to get through it, and hopefully it will be something that will be beneficial to us all. Let's pause for a minute and begin by asking the Lord to bless our time. Father, we're grateful to you for the opportunity we have this evening to be together and to continue our study in this book. We pray that as we look into it, that we might be able to glean from our studies those things that will help us to understand the book better, and also to understand the principles that are within it that helps us to be able to know how that we need to be conducting ourselves as we continue on in this life and as we anticipate the time of your return through your Son to judge this world. Please, Father, bless us in this time, and may you be honored and glorified by what we do. For we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let me start with a gulp of water here. Okay, where we left off was actually in the sixth bowl, and I had suggested to you that what the sixth bowl is depicting there for us is a picture of essentially God is confronting his enemies. It's the final battle that is actually being discussed there in the sixth bowl as we see this essentially it's a final showdown between God and his enemies. And we talked a little bit about that. I do want to just for the sake of review, mention the fact that in the midst of all of this, there is this parenthetical statement that is made by Jesus in verse 15 when he says, "Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be exposed." And what I believe Jesus is doing there is he's letting his people know that his return and the battle that ensues once he returns is going to be sudden, it's going to be unexpected, it's going to be something that is totally unpredictable. He's going to come, as he says, like a thief. And that matches a lot of the descriptive language that was used by the Lord, like for instance with respect to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. It also matches what Peter spoke about over in 2 Peter chapter 3 with respect to the end of this world that we now know, bringing in eventually the new heavens and the new earth, as he speaks about it over there. And he talks about that it's going to be like a thief. So it's something that, again, is totally unpredictable, which then helps us to understand that for people who try to do what they can by taking these symbols that are found in this book and coming up with some kind of what I would consider to be some harebrained ideas about predicting the end of the world is just it's an exercise in futility. That's not what this book was written for. It is written in order to encourage Christians as they have to go through the struggles and the sufferings that may be a part of their lot as a result of what you see the world doing to them because the fact that the world stands in opposition to the Lord. And so what Jesus is doing then is simply telling his people, you need to always be ready, be prepared, because he doesn't know when he's coming back. We don't know when he's coming back, but we know it's described as like a thief. And so in light of that, we need to be prepared. Okay, now that brings us then to the area that I wanted to begin with tonight, and that is the battle site itself. There are a few things that I think are more familiar to people's what do you want to call it, the pop culture, then certain words that are found in the book of Revelation. Apocalypse is one of them. I mean, they've made movies around it, like the great movie with, I can't think of his name right now, but anyway, Apocalypse Now, which was a Vietnam War flick. Then you also have other things like the number 666. These are all just things that are embedded in people's consciousness by virtue of the way pop culture treats these things. And what we're about to cover here, briefly, is another one that is very much common to people, although I would suspect that the majority of people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about when they talk about this. And that is the Battle of Armageddon. And what Jesus does in this is he points out where this is going to be, that is the battle site. And I use that term symbolically. And so what we see in this is, as Jesus speaks about this, it says in verse 16 that they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Okay, now I ask you a question about that. I think it's on question, it'd be lesson number 17, and it's on the question number 6. I ask you to give me your understanding of Armageddon, and I will entertain some thoughts about that before I just start lecturing again, because I do want to engage the class in this. So does anybody have any, well, let me qualify. Does anybody have any intelligent understanding of the book of this Armageddon? Cynthia?
Well, if my atlas is intelligent, then the answer would be it's an area in the northern section of Israel, in the Kishon River Valley.
Okay.
It's also called the Jezreel Valley, and there's a city of Megiddo, and also Mount Gilboa is there, and this is where there were many battles.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now what you're talking about, though, is a valley. And it was known as the Valley of Megiddo. And I'm glad you brought that up, because geographically, there are people who are saying that there is actually some place on this globe in the Middle East, and more or less in the area that you are describing, in which this battle is going to ensue. And depending upon who you're reading and when you were reading, like for instance, back in the 1970s, Hal Lindsey came up with his book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And in that particular book, he had pointed out that this battle was going to take place in this great big valley and everything like that. But this is Mount Megiddo. That's what Armageddon means. It means the mountain of Megiddo. Now, the next question is there such a place? And the answer is no. It doesn't exist. Anywhere on the globe, there is no such place as the Mount of Megiddo. And so you can search all day long for this particular location, and you will never find it. You will find the Valley of Megiddo. You will find a city that is called Megiddo. You will find, as Cynthia pointed out, this mountain in that region that is known as Mount Gilboa, but it's not Megiddo. There is no such place on the earth. And what that does is it tells us, I think if anything, it tells us this is symbolic. That it is not designed to actually speak about some kind of a geographical location. Now, what it does is it actually echoes what has been known as the plain of Megiddo, which is where Cynthia where she had Googled it, and I don't know if she Googled it, she said she looked on her atlas, but where she said it was. I guess that's the best way to point that out. There is this plain. It is located northeast of Jerusalem. And this is the profound point, though, that Cynthia made. And that is that in Jewish history, it is the scene of many ancient battles that had profound significance upon ancient Israel. And so, like, for instance, in Judges chapter 5, you remember with Deborah and Barak, and how it was that they were going after the Canaanites, and there was this king, or general by the name of Sisera, and that, bless his heart, the guy got a tent peg driven through his temple by a woman, and all of the things that went with that. But that was the changing of who is going to be in power now. And so this was an extremely significant battle that took place during the period of the Judges. And then you have another incident, which was also a profound change in the dynamics in this Middle Eastern part of the world back during the period of time in which Josiah reigned as king. Josiah was the last of the good kings of Judah. And he took it upon himself as the Egyptians to the south and the Babylonians to the north were in conflict with one another. They were coming together in order to fight this battle, and Josiah puts his nose into this thing, and he winds up getting himself killed. And of course, what that wound up doing was it just basically eviscerated Israel, so that now Babylon, after they took care of Egypt, they then went back and took care of Israel, or in this case, it would have been the northern kingdom of Judah. So it changed everything. The dynamics were changed enormously. And I believe that that's the point of what he is doing here, what John is seeing when he sees this mountain. That what this is talking about is a battle that is going to be so profound that it is going to have major implications for the rest of eternity. And so this battle is not describing a place, it's describing an event. And this event is not some kind of a literal, massive world war sometime in the future, beginning or ending somewhere in the Middle East. But what it is the great event of the final judgment of the enemies of God who have set themselves up against Jesus and against his people, an event that we will see fleshed out much more when we get into chapter 19, verses 11 through 20, in which you see there the actual battle. All this has done is mention it. But you're going to see the actual battle in chapter 19, verses 11 through 20, when it's talking about the beast, the false prophet, and everybody who followed them are going to be cast into the lake of fire. And then you're going to see a repeat of this, I believe, in the 20th chapter when it finally deals with the dragon, who is also going to be involved in a conflict. And he too is going to be eventually destroyed as he too is cast into the lake of fire. So again, what this is doing is it's signifying an event, and the event is the judgment of God, the final judgment of God. And as we will see when we get into chapters 19 and also into chapter 20, this is not going to be a prolonged battle. As a matter of fact, it is something that as it starts, it ends. It ends so suddenly. And Jesus and his people wind up being the victors. So it's not like this is going to be some kind of drawn out conflict. It's going to start and end, just like that. And what it's talking about is the final judgment of God. And so when you think of the Battle of Armageddon, whenever you hear that phraseology, if you're going to be able to converse intelligently about that with somebody who obviously does not have the intelligence as to what it's all about, all you have to do is point out to them that this battle is being fought in the 19th chapter, it's fought in the 20th chapter, and in both cases, it's talking about the final judgment of God, which is what this is symbolizing. And so that's all this is. It's just a type of technique in which John is symbolizing the ultimate conflict that is going to come about, in which God judges the beast, both of the beast, the false prophet, all of the followers, and Satan himself. And God is going to be victorious in all of that. Okay, now we will flesh that out when we get into the 19th chapter, which will be obviously a little bit later on. Okay, so that brings us then to the seventh bowl. And the seventh bowl is basically, what I'm suggesting, is that it is now judgment upon the dark powers of evil. And so you see the pouring out of the seventh bowl, which is giving a final perspective on the completion of God's judgment, as it is understood in a voice that is coming from God's heavenly temple, making the statement there in chapter 16, verse 17. At the very end of that verse, he says, "It is done." In other words, with this, the wrath of God is completed. Judgment is finished. It is done. So, this bowl is poured out. Where's it poured out? Into the air. Okay, it's poured out into the air. Now, I did have a question about that. So, what do you think the significance of it is? And I gave you some verses to help you think about this. What do you think is the significance of the bowl being poured out into the air? Joanne? Okay. All right, but particularly who? Who would be affected? Well, no, they would be affected, obviously. Everyone would be affected, but particularly this is aimed at one particular person, if you will.
But I think it's spiritual, it's the
Okay.
spiritual
Right. That's exactly right. So these passages that I gave you, like over here in the Ephesian letter, in Ephesians chapter 2, there in the second verse, he talks about how that the Gentiles, he said, you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the sons of disobedience. And then again in this 6th chapter of Ephesians, when he is talking about the panoply or the armor that we are to be putting on in order to be able to combat Satan and these spiritual hosts of wickedness, it is interesting that the way he describes this, in verse 12, he says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And so what that is suggesting then is that by pouring it out into the air, it is being poured out into the realm of where Satan works. And so the idea then, I believe, of the pouring out of this 7th bowl is the fact that this is dealing with Satan, his domain, his evil dominion, and Satan is the source from which all wickedness and evil has come that has afflicted the creation of God and has had such a powerful influence upon his creation, particularly the crowning of his creation, which is human beings. And so when it says he's pouring it out into the air, the idea is judgment is now coming upon Satan. Remember that in the pouring out of these bowls, I suggested to you that in the first 4 bowls, what you are seeing is judgment that is coming upon the followers of the beast, followers of the dragon. Then the 5th and 6th bowls, it's being poured out on the beast and his kingdom, and then the 7th bowl is being poured out on the dragon. It is being poured out on Satan himself. And so the result of all of this, as is indicated there in verses 20 and 21 in particular, well, verse 18 and verses 18 through 21, what you see is this, how would I describe it? It is cataclysmic that is going on here. It is something in which the cosmic as well as the terrestrial things are being affected. They're being brought to destruction. And it is destruction that is described as being so profound that it has never been seen in human history. That's the way he describes it there in this 18th verse. When he says, and there were flashes of lightnings, rumblings, peals of thunders, and a great earthquake such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So there's never been anything that is like this. And I believe that what it's doing, therefore, is symbolizing God's work of judgment finally being brought to its completion, because it has taken in everyone, and now it is finally getting to the one who's caused it all. And so what is happening then is it's being brought to completion. And if you'll remember, back when we were studying the seals, when we were looking at the 6th seal, I suggested to you that that's a preview of the final judgment that is now being given. And interestingly enough, when you read that 6th seal and the opening of that 6th seal, it's very much like what is being described here. And so what is being done then is that it's basically a symbolism of this idea that God has come in final judgment, and then with all of these cataclysmic events, it appears to me at least that what this is doing is demonstrating the passing away of the first heavens and the first earth, making its way now for the new heavens and the new earth. And that's exactly what Peter said would happen. You look at the way Peter describes it in 2 Peter chapter 3 about the universe being consumed in fire, so that now there is the new heavens and the new earth that comes into existence. And in Revelation chapter 21, we will see the introduction of the new creation, as this is the place that the faithful, those who belong to the Lord, can anticipate that they will one day populate. Okay, so in the middle of all of this description, though, there is introduced once again the city of Babylon. And it is specifically called out, and it is specifically targeted for God's holy and righteous wrath. Verse 19, where it says, the great city was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. Now, Babylon has already been introduced to us at least twice, but there's never really been any kind of definitive description of her. She's already been introduced in the 11th chapter in verse 8, where she was talked about as being the place of Jesus' crucifixion and where all of his witnesses are murdered. And then in the 14th chapter in verse 8, she is again mentioned as having fallen, along with describing all of this horrible role that she played, this malevolent sort of behavior that she manifested in seducing and in intoxicating the nations. And here we see her now specifically targeted for God's judgment. Now that's going to be expanded on in chapters 17 and 18 as we see first who she is, and then in the 18th chapter we see how that Babylon has fallen. And we'll get to that, at least we'll begin that here in just a few minutes. Okay, so Babylon, it says, is split into three parts. And the splitting of these three parts pulls down with her the cities of all of the nations. Now, there are different ideas that have been offered to try to explain this particular symbolism, and I'm not going to get into all of that except to give you what I believe to be the best explanation of what is actually being revealed here, what is being spoken about. And what we need to do is to, again, understand that the book of Revelation borrows heavily from the Old Testament. And so in light of that, there are certain things within the Old Testament that actually speak to this. One of the ones is found over in the book of Ezekiel in the 5th chapter. And in that chapter, there is Ezekiel's prophesying of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And you might remember how it was that Ezekiel shaved his beard. And in the shaving of the beard, then it was to be cut up into three sections. One was to be burned, one was to be devoted to the sword, and the other one was to be scattered to the wind. And what that simply meant is that Jerusalem's destruction is going to be total. Which, of course, we know what happened when Babylon came in. They totally destroyed Jerusalem. And so the idea of splitting it up into three parts is simply the idea that there is going to be total destruction that is going to be rendered. And then when you get into, again, another of the books that the book of Revelation borrows from a lot, and that's the book of Zechariah. In the 14th chapter, Zechariah is prophesying the day of the Lord's battle against the nations and the salvation of his people and the destruction of their enemies. And he points out in that particular prophecy that there is this terrifying earthquake that splits the Mount of Olives. And what that is doing is signifying God's judgment on the nations and Israel's deliverance, both allowing the forces to come in and defeat Israel, but then also splitting it because God is leaving, because his temple was destroyed. And so the idea then again carries with it this idea of total destruction. And it would seem then to me, based upon how this symbolism is used in other places in the Old Testament, that Babylon being split into three parts and pulling the nations down with her is again indicating total destruction that is brought about by God's judgment, which is again going to be fleshed out when we get into chapter 17 and 18. And so the scene of this great city's destruction serves to reassure this suffering church that Babylon, and whatever it is that she represents, Babylon is going to be destroyed. Now, what the readers of John's day would have understood is Rome, because obviously Rome would be in the symbolism. In fact, Peter even talks about Babylon being Rome in one of the letters that he wrote. But this is who they would have seen, I believe. But what I'm going to be suggesting as we go through this is that we should not limit our understanding to only Rome. Because what it's doing is looking to the final judgment of God's wrath being fixed upon all human culture and all unjust social structures that it creates. Rome just happened to be a manifestation of that. Okay, so bringing this part of it to its conclusion then. This outpouring of the bowls of God's wrath is simply revealing what is a graphic portrait of what is yet to come, and that is God's final judgment upon all that stands in opposition to him, all that oppresses people, and all that have ruined his creation. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we know it's going to happen. And in the meantime, what we need to do is what Jesus said in the 15th verse of this chapter, and that is, stay awake. Do not allow ourselves to be seduced by the lies and the deceitfulness of what may appear to be some kind of impressive glitz and glamour of an ungodly social structure and all of the things that are associated with it, that at the core are unjust, they are rotten, and they are decaying. Because if we find ourselves getting caught up in that, then we might find ourselves also getting caught up in God's wrath. Okay. Any observations before we get into chapter 17 then, in this great prostitute? Cynthia.
Just a little bit more about Babylon. I think it helps us to remember the origins of Babylon. They thought they were so smart and so powerful and so prideful that they could build a tower to heaven.
Right. You're getting ahead of me. You're getting ahead of me. Because we're going to talk about who Babylon is, and we will use that. And then I'll give you the floor so that you can talk about what it is that you're going to be saying. Mark?
I think the language in this being the final judgment also echoes that in 2 Peter 3, which there is a description of the earth.
Right.
Creation.
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
Deconstruct. Here the island disappears. The
Right.
The place becomes uninhabitable. No one is unaffected by it. Those elements are
Right.
the language is identical.
Right.
This
But
idea
it's...
of- it's maybe the view from the air, maybe
Mhm.
in 2 Peter 3, and this is the view from the ground of the earth being deconstructed.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's right. So you have, again, I don't see how you can read this and not come to 2 Peter chapter 3. It's just clear that that's being explained in graphic detail here in this chapter. Okay. Now, as we begin this part of our study on Babylon herself, who is referred to as this great prostitute, I want to take us back to the very beginning of the book of Revelation in order to set the scene so that we might be able to appreciate a little bit more what is about to unfold here. When we began our study of the book of Revelation, we saw that it began with Jesus walking among his churches. And we saw how it was that he was comforting them. And this, of course, would have been comfort to these suffering Christians during this period of time. So they're comforted by the knowledge of Jesus being among his churches, that he knows their situation. He's assessing their condition. He praises them for their strengths. He exposes their weaknesses, and he gives them warnings. And he assures his churches that he is able to provide for them whatever it is that they need in order to be strong in their faith, which will ultimately lead them to final victory in the spiritual conflict that they find themselves in. And that's what the first 3 chapters of Revelation are all about. Now, what I want to do is I want to note with you areas of weakness within some of the churches that were addressed. The church at Pergamum had in their midst those who were tolerating the influence of the Nicolaitans. And basically what they were doing was opening themselves up to the compromising of their faith. Then you have the church at Thyatira. She was tolerating Jezebel. Jezebel was seducing some of those Christians into spiritual idolatry. And a lot of this centered around the pagan temples that they had. It dealt with their unions, their work unions that were associated with these temples. The church at Laodicea. The church at Laodicea took pride in its affluence and the fact that it was self-reliant, and it had this smug attitude of self-reliance, and they were totally oblivious to the real problems of spiritual poverty and spiritual blindness that was among them. Okay, so you see the churches in the first century, they had their problems. And what we see in this is that the church in the first century struggled with the temptation to sacrifice their faithfulness to Jesus, compromising with the culture of their day, which is a problem that Christians have always struggled with and continue to struggle with. So in the first century, there were many things about the Roman Empire that were attractive. There was a sense of peace and security, what was actually called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And basically what it was is if you didn't get along with Rome, they were going to come in and basically wipe you out. And they had this massive army, so everybody was at peace. At least ostensibly, they were at peace. Another of the things that they added was the lavish provisions of entertainment and amusement. I mean, there is still a structure to this day that is in the city of Rome that obviously it's kind of fallen apart a little bit, but people go over there and they travel to see this magnificent stadium in which all of this amusement and all of this entertainment was people were participating in. It also had a flourishing economy. It had a flourishing sense of commerce. And all of that would produce the temptation to compromise with such an attractive culture. And so here in Revelation 17, John is seeing a vision about Babylon, and she is characterized as a great prostitute. And right from the very start, that implies a superficial attractiveness, which is the very thing that explains how she could be so alluring, not only to people of the world, but even to God's people. And so in this vision, John sees that behind all of the glitz, all of the makeup, all of the sensual clothing that would be associated with prostitution, what John sees is this superficial attractiveness which makes her alluring. Underneath it all is something that is so profoundly foul that they have to be aware of it. And what we also see is Babylon's disgraceful destruction at the very hands of her own patrons, those whom she seduced and those who cast their lots with her. They will eventually turn on her. And so what we're seeing here in chapter 17 and also in chapter 18 is a detailed version of the judgment of Babylon that was briefly described in the pouring out of the seventh bowl. And the reason for this is because in light of God's coming final judgment, God's people are challenged to look beyond the superficial appearances of what are godless social structures of fallen human culture, and to be able to observe and to identify the extremely rotten spiritual and moral reality which is at its very core, which is what leads to destruction. N.T. Wright put it this way. He said, John's point is that the outward appearance of the whore is magnificent, but the inner reality is disgusting, stomach-churning filth. Okay, so we come to Babylon, this great prostitute. And so we ask the question, who or what is Babylon? Now this goes to Cynthia. The floor is yours now, dear.
Okay. Well, I already said most of it, but so outwardly, this temple, this tower they were building, they were so pride.
And that's in the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And God there confused their language.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it turned out that all the nations became enemies of one another because they couldn't communicate.
Right, right.
So that's the source of a lot of that conflict.
To this day. To this day, that's right. Okay, so I want to expand on that a little bit because Cynthia, I think, is spot on with her analysis of this. When you look back into Old Testament history, Babylon, in all of its different iterations, there was Babylon, the ancient Babylon, and then the kingdom that we see defeating Judah, that was known as Neo-Babylon, New Babylon. And so what you see in all of the different iterations of Babylon throughout biblical history was an empire that was characterized by this arrogance and by this rebellion against God who continually oppressed God's people. Now back a few lessons ago, this symbolism of Babylon would have been understood by the first century Christians as a code name for the pagan power that was oppressing them. And that was Rome and the world system it represented. In fact, as I said in 1 Peter, I have it now here in my notes, 1 Peter 5 verse 13, Peter talks about that he is writing from Babylon. Well, he was writing from Rome when he wrote what he wrote. And that's a point that we'll come back to. And so to understand Babylon and how John is using this symbol, we first of all, it seems to me, we need to review what the beast represents, since Babylon, as we will see in the 17th chapter, verse 3, Babylon, it says, is riding the beast. She is sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 horns, or 7 heads and 10 horns. And then you see this again in verse 7. I tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. So Babylon is riding on the back of the beast. Now the question is, in order to appreciate what's going on here, we have to do a little bit of review to understand who the beast is. Okay, so what I have suggested is that the beast is symbolic of idolatrous, godless world empire which has been raised up by Satan to fight against God's people. And again, in John's day, this would have been Rome. And the way the beast manifests itself is through world empire, by setting up structures of injustice, which would include political structures. It would include the military, structures of economics, structures of technology, structures of education. In fact, any kind of a social system that could be used to stand against God and His people, stand against God and His will, and ruin His creation. So I've suggested, therefore, that what Babylon is basically it is symbolic of all of the evil structures of injustice, however it is manifested. And in fact, one author I was reading after, I love the way he put this. He said, it is the power grid of fallen human culture. And so what this should help us to see is that John's first century audience would have seen in this imagery the Roman Empire with all of its social structures of injustice that was being used against them. But what we need to understand is that although Babylon is not less than the Roman Empire, it is much more. Because what it is doing is symbolizing fallen human culture and the evil, unjust social structures that have been created by fallen human culture no matter what period of history one might be living in. And I would say to you that Babylon has always been with us. It is still with us. So Babylon, in a broad sense, is simply symbolizing fallen human culture and all of the unjust social structures that it creates. But in a very narrow sense, as I have said, it would have been understood by the first century Christians to represent Rome, which as G.B. Card put it, he said Rome was simply her latest and most powerful incarnation. So Babylon has always been around. As Cynthia pointed out, it goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. In that case, it was literal. But what we're talking about then is basically, as this one man wrote, it is the power grid of fallen human culture. And so the question then that needs to be asked is, why is she described as a prostitute? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Todd? Okay. But how does she do it? She's attractive, really attractive. Okay. Now, I want to suggest some things to you that I think is really significant in all of this. The first one is that what this does, this imagery serves as a negative image or a parody of the climactic image of the Bible or of the bride of Jesus, who is the wife of the Lamb. Babylon is promiscuous. Babylon is an unfaithful woman of the beast who has her own sort of attractiveness and splendor. And you'll see that in chapter 17, verse 7, talking about how she's all dolled up and all this great kind of jewelry that she possesses. And that is in contradistinction to the wife of the Lamb, who is loving, who is faithful, and has her own sort of splendor that we will see when we get to chapter 21. But the beauty of the prostitute is a sham, and it is short-lived. And it is brought down, as we will see in the 18th chapter, it's brought down in 1 hour. Whereas the beauty of the bride is genuine and it's eternal. And so what we are seeing then is a contrast between what oftentimes attracts people, but we will see the true bride who is faithful to her husband. So there's a parody here in Babylon. She's a parody of the bride, essentially. A second thing, and this goes to what Todd was talking about, it conveys the connected ideas of oppression and destruction. I'm not going to take the time because we got about 5 minutes left, but I'm sure most of you have read Proverbs chapter 7 about the young man who has been seduced by the prostitute, takes her to his home, and she just is really convincing him that this is what you need to be doing and everything like that. And then what winds up happening is that the young man destroys his life. Okay, that's the nature of prostitution. Prostitution Have you ever wondered why it is that there are women who are out here selling their bodies? And why it is that there are men who are willing to pay the price to use those women? I mean, I'm convinced a lot of women do it because it's the only way they can make money. But what about men? Why do they do it? Yeah, lust. It's something that's real quick and something you get a great deal of pleasure out of. Okay, so that's the nature of prostitution. It's built upon fantasy. That you can fulfill your wildest dreams if you are willing to pay the price. But what is the actual price? The rulers of the world, and I don't care whatever period of time you're talking about, the rulers of the world, the millionaires, the billionaires, the leaders in technology, the leaders in education, the leaders in industry, the corporate executives, all of these people are people who line up to use Babylon for their own pleasure. And they have been seduced by the siren call of pagan empire and fallen human culture, not knowing that what they are doing is they are going to destruction. And so using this imagery then would help God's people of the first century, and I think it should help God's people of any generation to know that allowing themselves to be seduced by Babylon with all of her superficial attractiveness, it's only going to lead them down the road to destruction because Babylon is condemned. And that's what we see there in chapter 16, verse 19 in the seventh bowl. How it is that God remembered Babylon to make her drain the cup and the wine of the fury of his wrath. She is going to be destroyed. Okay, now we have a description of Babylon. But before we actually look at this description, there's an interesting thing that happens here. Well, let me back that one up because we don't need that one yet. John is taken to the wilderness to view this woman. Now, you might remember that earlier in the book of Revelation, the wilderness was the place where the church was taken to be protected from the evil of the dragon. And here it appears John is being taken to the wilderness to put him in a place of safety where he will not be allured by Babylon's deceptive appearance, so that he therefore can accurately testify against her horrible spiritual and moral ugliness. And so she is described as seated on many waters, symbolizing the many nations and the many peoples that she rules over. She is sitting on a scarlet beast, which is clearly the sea beast of chapter 13, verse 1, from which she gets her power. Godless world empire supports fallen human culture, which in John's day would have been manifested in the city of Rome, in the Roman Empire itself. And as we've noted, she is described as having a type of grandeur, as seen in the clothes she wears, the jewels that adorn her, which also provides a preview of the kind of the exquisite imports by which Rome in particular made the merchants of the ancient world very wealthy. And she also holds a golden bowl filled with abominations, which symbolizes the moral and the spiritual trash by which she makes the nations and their kings drunk. That is, they are so intoxicated by what she can give them that they are numbed to the reality of her foulness. She is depicted as being drunk with the blood of the saints. And what that means, I believe, is that God's faithful people who refuse to be seduced by her allurements and cannot be forced into it, they are eliminated. They are killed. So, she drinks the blood of the saints. And so when John sees this image, he is said in verse 6 to marvel. And some have suggested that may mean that even in the wilderness, when he's protected, he experiences the appeal of the prostitute's visual lure and all of this luxury. But I think there's something else to this. I think it's probably more so it means that he's experiencing horrific astonishment by her allure and by her power that she has over all of the nations and the kings and the harm that she inflicts upon the people of God. And so that's why he's marveling. How alluring she really is. And so having displayed this horrific astonishment is what he's just seen, the angel tries to calm him down. Calm his anxieties, providing a deeper understanding, further explaining this interdependent relationship between the prostitute, between Babylon and the beast. Now, this is where we're going to end, but I will make this one observation before we quit. When you start at verse 7, the angel says, let me tell you what this is all about. And so I read through it before I looked at any other kind of source. And I thought, well, now, isn't this ironic? I even made a note about it here. John is receiving, apparently, information to clear things up. But for the modern reader, not only does it not clear it up, it makes it more complicated. So that's where we'll start on Sunday, figuring out what is the interpretation of Babylon. All right, thank you all for your participation this evening.